Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We are continuing our study of Shemuel Bet. We're in chapter 11, Perek Yud Aleph. We just came off the heels of two chapters, 9 and 10, which we did in our last class, which talked about David's kindnesses, right? David establishing his kingdom on the concept of kindness. We saw one of them was a great kindness that he did to the family of Shaul and ended up saving Mephibosheth, the son of Yonatan, Shaul's grandson, from a very disastrous situation that he was in. Then he tried to continue that kindness, but we saw a little bit of misplaced kindness. We saw David kind of conflate his own personal issues with Ammon and what he went through running with Shaul with the idea that, you know, Ammon is a sworn enemy of the Jewish people, somebody who the Torah commands us not to seek their welfare and to do kindness with them. And so David conflated his own personal issues with the issues and the needs of the kingdom. And we saw that that led to war, to multiple battles. Eventually, David helps Yoav to be successful, but it doesn't come without tension and without issues. And that battle is going to continue now into chapter 11. And once again, David is going to pay the price for separating himself or removing himself personally from the needs of the rest of his kingdom. Case in point, David's going to begin chapter 11 away from the battlefield. Yoav and his men are going to be fighting a fierce battle against Ammon, the continuation of last chapter. But David, as we will see, is not there to be found. Make sure that everyone here is on you. Very good. Okay. Now, a disclaimer about this chapter. This chapter, the next, are perhaps some of the most challenging and difficult chapters to read in all of the Tanakh. I feel like I've said that many, many times before. I think Pilegish Begiv'ah, the story of the concubine, is one of the most horrific stories. This is one of the most challenging stories to grapple with because we're going to read about a hero of ours, David HaMelech, who does something, multiple actions that are somewhat unconscionable, that for the average person would say, I don't see what's so great about David after I read about these things. So we have to read it with a certain sense of humility and trepidation, understanding that we're dealing with a larger than life type of character. What he's going to do, we're not going to simply let him off the hook or whitewash it. By the end of it, we're going to have to look at the array of different approaches that the rabbis and different commentaries take. We're not going to let David off the hook. We're going to do it as the way we would do every single chapter. We're going to analyze the words. We're going to look at the text. We're going to talk about it. And then hopefully by the end, we'll try to come to some level of understanding of how this happened. What are the lessons that we can take out of it, while still understanding that David is the figure who he is. The kingdom will not be taken away from him. He's still David HaMelech, the savior of the Jewish people, the father of the Mashiach, and from whom all kings will descend. And we'll have to understand how that could be, especially after David does this very difficult act. So with all of that in mind, we dive into chapter 11. ויהי לתשובת השנה לעת צאת המלכים, וישלח דוד את יואב ואת עבדיו עמו, ואת כל ישראל, וישחיתו את בני עמון, ויצורו על רבה, ודוד יושב בירושלים. So at the turn of the year, the season when the kings usually go out to battle, David sent Yoav with his officers and all Israel with him, and they devastated Ammon and besieged Rabbah. David remained in Yerushalayim. So an interesting headline to this chapter. It is the time in which kings normally go out to battle, yet where is David? David is sitting comfortably in the city of Yerushalayim, in his capital, while the rest of his army and his men go about fighting an intense battle against Ammon. And it's strange, we don't know why David did not go out to fight. We saw that he did make a fight in the previous chapter, but in the continuing battle, as it rages on, David somehow finds himself back in Yerushalayim. And we'll see in a moment that not only is he in Yerushalayim, but he's also very comfortable and very disconnected from what his people are going through. Let's continue. And this leads to David's problem, because what happens? Vayhi le'et erev, what late one afternoon, Vayakom David me'alish mishkavo. David rises from his couch, from his place of lying down, which already gives you a feeling of David is taking an afternoon siesta, a little nap over here, and he wakes up in the late afternoon. Why David is sleeping at this time is a bit strange. In fact, it doesn't really fit with the personification that the rabbis give of David as somebody who is aggressive to Torah and learns and is up in the midnight. There's a pasuk in Tehillim that says, Chatzot laila akum lehodot lach. In the middle of the night, and David is coming to give praise and thanks to Hashem. Maybe David learned his lesson from this experience. In the middle of the day, he wakes up, Vayithalech al gag bet hamelech, and he strolls on the roof of the house of the king. Vayar isha rochetzet me'al hagag, and he gazes at a woman who is bathing from above the roof. Ve'ha'isha tovat mar'eh me'od, and the woman is very attractive. So first of all, well, let's read a little bit more and see, and then we'll come back to this pasuk. Vayishlach David vayidrosh leisha. David sends messengers to seek out the woman to find out who she is. Vayomer, and they come back and say, Halozot BatSheva bat Eliam eshet Uriah haHiti. This woman is the name of BatSheva. She's the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah haHiti. But she is. She's a member of. Yeah, she's there. She's a member. Uriah haHiti obviously converted to Judaism and is part of the Jewish battle. We're going to see Uriah is fighting. The reason why you have to ask yourself the question: why does David want to know about this woman? Why does he want to seek her out? Why does he find out more information about her? Well, David wants to know likely where her husband is, right? He assumes, I guess for now, either A, he wants to figure out her marital status, and if she is married, then is her husband around? And David gets a very good answer for himself, that he finds out she is married, which is not great, but that her husband is Uriah haHiti, who he knows is in the battlefield, so is not present, is not home at this time. We find that Eliam also, we'll read about him a little bit later on. He's also a warrior who's who's in the battlefield. Vayishlach David malachim, so David once again sends messengers, vayikaheha, and they take her. Vatavo elav, and she comes to him, vayishkav ima, and he lays with her. Vehi mitkadeshet mitum'ata, she has just been purified after her time of defilement. In other words, she's gone through a period now, she's ready to be with her husband. Vatashov el beta, and she returns, David sends her back home. Now, pause here. So what just took place? David saw a woman, he desired her, he inquires about her, he figures that her husband's not home, so he can get away with sleeping with her. He calls to her, she comes to him, and he sleeps with her. And at this point, the story might end. As it is, it's pretty bad, right? Basically, David, at face value, slept with a married woman, right? Yeah, lo tin'af, he committed an act of adultery. The situation though is going to become much more complicated with this in a moment. And that's because we're going to find out that BatSheva becomes pregnant, which is the reason why the pasuk in Dalet probably told us that she was mitkadeshet mitum'atat, that she was purifying herself after her period, because we know that that's a time that women are very susceptible to getting pregnant. It also tells us that David cannot pin this on anybody else. He cannot say, oh, it was her husband, and before he left to war or something like that, because she wasn't allowed to him at that time. So David is clearly the culprit. So now comes the issue here. How is David going to handle this situation? Verse 5, yeah.
Why does she bear no blame?
We'll talk about BatSheva's culpability here. I'm very happy that you brought it up, because I was going to bring it up, and usually when the guy brings it up, then women get very upset, because what is she supposed to do, right? That David was the one. Does BatSheva bear responsibility for what took place, right? As far as we're concerned, when you read the story, it seems that David is the active person, BatSheva is passive. BatSheva is taken, she's the correct. Okay, but is she blameless in the situation, is what Esther's asking? You can make the argument that she had no choice, right? That it's coercion. Now, we don't want to say that David necessarily raped her, but the idea that when the king calls for you, you don't really have much of a choice to say no, so she's kind of forced. And in fact, the rabbis bring this up in the Gemara in Masechet Ketubot, Daf Tet Amud Aleph. Why? Because the Gemara asks a question. Generally speaking, the rule is, if God forbid a woman commits adultery, she is not allowed to marry or remain with either her husband or the adulterer, or the man whom she committed adultery with. She would have to be separated from both of them. So the question is going to become, we don't know it yet, but I'll preempt you, and by the end of the story, David will end up marrying BatSheva. And so the rabbis all ask the question, how can David marry a woman with whom he committed adultery? if that's the way we're to understand it at face value. And the rabbi said it's not a problem because because she was coerced. So a woman is only prohibited to her adulterer if she did it willingly. But if she did not commit adultery willingly, she was coerced, then she is permitted to be with her adulterer. In fact, there's a law in the Torah that says if, God forbid, a woman is raped, she has no choice but to marry that guy. That guy ends up being, the Torah puts it on the guy. The guy has an obligation to marry her. And to understand that, you would have to understand a little bit about ancient society, which is that if, God forbid, a woman was raped, nobody else would want to marry her. So the Torah is actually doing a great kindness for the woman because now she's going to wonder, how am I going to take care of myself? How am I going to get married? How's anybody going to support me? So the Torah says that she can refuse, by the way. She doesn't have to accept it. But the Torah says that the adult, the one who committed the act of rape, is obligated now to marry her. Well, that's essentially what it is. But that's essentially what it is. In the ancient world, in the Torah's world, marriage is an arrangement to a certain deal. Of course, it's to have children. Of course, there's obviously feelings of love and intimacy, but at its deepest, at its most basic level, I should say, it's also an arrangement in which the husband's going to take care of the woman. In any case, we come back to our point, which is that a woman is only prohibited to her adulterer if she does so willingly. If she's coerced, which is what the Gemara says happened over here, then she's permitted to him. When we say coerced, we don't mean a rape, we mean that she felt that she had an obligation. The question is the text maybe hinting to us over here that BatSheva was quote unquote coerced, but also was very flattered and really did so somewhat willingly? We'll have to pick up on those clues. Remind me to get back to that. Yeah. Okay, good. So the bathing on the roof is another one. You know what? Why don't we just do it now because we're bringing it up? No, it's very good. Because we mentioned that she was, the pasuk in Bet says that he saw a woman, rochetzet, she was bathing, me'al hagag, from on top of the roof. So the rabbis are a little confused. Where is BatSheva and where is David? He's on the roof. Where is she? Good. And the rabbis point this out, that Adak explains it this way based on the language of me'al hagag. If it was that BatSheva was bathing on the roof as well, it should have said Vayar Isha Rochetzet al Hagag. He saw a woman on the roof, right? That's not what it says. It says Vayar Isha. He saw a woman that was bathing. From what vantage point did he see her? Me al Hagag, from his roof, right? Which fits with the beginning of the pasuk, because the pasuk says Vayithalech al Hagag. So David is on the roof and he's looking downward and he's able to see into BatSheva's home while she is bathing. Now, it's still a problem because why is the text telling us this? It tells us that perhaps BatSheva was not intentionally wanting David to see, but she's clearly not careful. Women should not be so callous and negligent as to have an opportunity for men to be able to look at them while they're bathing. And so,
think of that she was after Nidab, she's supposed to be modest about it.
Very good. So all of this seems to call into question whether or not BatSheva was somewhat,
Not blameless.
careless. Another hint comes from Pasuk Daled. Pasuk Daled, it says that David sent messengers, Vayikaheha, and they took her, Vatavo elav, and she came to him, Vayishkav ima, and he lied with her. Now those words Vatavo elav are interesting. Why is those words there? And she came to him. It could have easily said, David sent messengers, Vayikacheha, he took her, Vayishkavima, and he laid with her. What does Vatavo elav mean? It sounds a little bit like, even though she was taken, at the same time, Vatavo elav, she came to him. It's almost like she's being forced, but somewhere deep down, she's very flattered that the king wants to see her and wants to be with her. So there is a feeling of, I'm willing to go along with this. I'm not going to put up much of a stink. Of course, there's always that thing, well, he's the king. What am I supposed to do? But really deep down, the text is hinting to us, she had it. Exactly. Interesting one. Yeah, I thought about that as well. Esther does not say vatavo elav, right? It says vatilakah Esther el bet hamelech, right? That she is actively taken.
Ambivalence, yes.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, sure. So that seems to be what's going on over here, right? She's deliberately creating something of a situation. I also saw Rabbi Bazak points out something else about the idea that she was purifying herself. Why is that necessary? I saw him mention something over here. Yeah, why is the text telling us that? Where was it over here? Here, BatSheva. He says that Rikera katav shapasuk no'ad lahasbir madua ne'elatz David lahazdik et Uriah min ha'ma'aracha. Rikera explains, as I said before, that why does David have to call Uriah back from the battlefield? Because it's obvious if he doesn't get Uriah back in the picture to sleep with BatSheva, when she becomes pregnant, everybody's going to know it's obviously not from her husband. Right? He says, he says this was to mention something negative about David. That David, the time that a woman purifies herself and now is ready to be back with her husband, that's a high time. That David should so callously take BatSheva at that specific time when she's preparing for her husband, instead going with BatSheva, is to show you that David had a very, very little compassion over here, very little sense of, maybe I'm doing the wrong thing as far as how he was looking at it towards Uriah. So it seems as though there's a little bit of culpability kind of going on between everybody, as it is over here, of course. Any other questions? Okay, so let's see what happens. Verse 5, BatSheva sends David the bad news. Vatahar ha'isha, she becomes pregnant. Vatishlach vataged David, and she sends word to tell David, Vatomer hara anochi. She says, I have become pregnant. Now David's got a problem. So what does David do? Vaishlach David el Yoav. David sends messages to Yoav. Shelach elai et Uriah hachiti. Send home Uriah hachiti. Vaishlach Yoav et Uriah el David. And Yoav sends Uriah back to David. Vayavo Uriah elav. Uriah comes to David. Vayishal David l'shlom Yoav v'l'shlom ha'am v'l'shlom ha'milchama. David greets Uriah pleasantly, and he wants to know, how's Yoav doing? How are the people doing? What's going on in war? David's pretending as if what? As if it's just a casual checkup. He cares about what's going on, that he brought Yoav home to give him a report back from the battlefield. But does David really care about that? Doesn't seem like David really cares about that. He's covering his tracks because about what he wants to do now. What he really wants is for Yoav to go home and be with his wife, so that he can get rid of any culpability towards impregnating his wife. Verse 8, Vayomer David Uriah, red lebetecha urhatz raglecha. David says to Uriah, go down to your home and wash your feet. What do you think wash your feet means? It's a euphemism. He's telling him, be with your wife, right? David is speaking like in flowery language and euphemistic, and he's not going to directly mention it to him because he doesn't want to give away what he's saying. Watch, and you'll see this in comparison to how Uriah responds to him. Vayetze Uriah mi bet hamelech. Uriah leaves the house of the king. Vatetze acharav mas'at hamelech. And he does so in the presence of the king follows him. In other words, the officers of the king are following him. Verse 9, Vayishkav Uriah petach bet hamelech. Uriah goes to sleep and spends the night at the entranceway to the house of the king. Et kol avdei adonav, together with all of the servants of the king. Velo yarad el beto, and he doesn't go down to his home. Why? Why? So he says why. Vayaged David lemor. It's told to David, lo yarad Uriah el beto. Uriah didn't go home. Vayomer David el Uriah. David says to Uriah, halo miderech ataba. I don't understand. You came from an intense journey. You're probably very tired. You should be going to your house. Madua lo yaradta el betecha. Why didn't you go down to your house? Vayomer Uriah el David. Uriah says to David, Ha'aron ve'Yisrael ve'Yehuda yoshvim basukot. The ark of God and the Jewish people and the members of Judah, they're all dwelling in huts, in Sukkot, in the camp. Va'adoni Yoav, and my master Yoav, ve'avdei Adoni, and the servants of my master, al penei hasadeh onim. They're out in the fields. They're not in their homes. They're not in comfortable, relaxed environments. ואני אבוא אל ביתי לאכול ולשתות ולשכב עם אשתי, and I should go to my home to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife. Notice how he uses the actual term. He says l'shkav im ishti. He doesn't beat around the bush because he knows David, was using a euphemism. He says hayecha v'chen nafshecha, on my life and on the life of my soul. If I shall do such a thing. In other words, what does Uriah say? It's not appropriate for me to go home. I'm a soldier. My people are at battle. I'm in a state of I don't know what the word is. In flux. What? He's saying I'm still on my mission. I'm not comfortable. I don't feel it's appropriate for me to go relax and be with my wife and eat and drink while all my brothers are at war, are in battle, right? If you've ever talked to an Israeli soldier who's like, say, on reserve or is, let's say, wasn't called up and being drafted while members of his unit are fighting, they have a hard time. They feel like their brothers are battling, and how could I be here just, enjoying my life casually?
I've got other fish to fry.
Yes, exactly. He's got other things that he needs to deal with, for sure. Yeah.
So it's sort of a slap in the face to David saying like, that maybe should have been the way we should have thought.
It's exactly that.
But also on the other hand, it's like, okay, so you got to retreat from the rule. Why don't you go home and be with your wife?
Right.
So it's like.
So clearly Uriah in these words is sending a message to David, right? He's speaking harshly to the king because he's telling the king exactly what I won't do is what you're doing, right? You should be there with us. You should be fighting with us. And you're here lounging and strolling and taking it easy while all of us are fighting. I will not do that same thing that you are doing. And beneath it is the idea that that's what got David into trouble. That's what got David into this whole mess in the first place, was that he's not at the battle with the people and he's taking his life easy. Now, I want to say over here, Rabbi Amnon Bazak has a very interesting claim. Can you tell me what you think about this claim? He wants to make the claim that Uriah knows. Uriah knows. And I'll tell you what his claim, he's found out that what? I have a hard time with it, but this is his claim. He wants to say that Uriah spent the night with the officers because David did something very interesting. If you notice throughout this chapter, there's a word that keeps repeating itself over and over again, a milat mancha, a key word. It appears actually 12 times. David does everything through what? Through messengers. Consistently, you're seeing the word vayishlach over and over again. If you go back to the beginning right away when he sees BatSheva, verse 3, vayishlach David, he calls to get her. Verse 4, vayishlach David malachim. Verse 6, Vaishlach David el Yoav, Shelach Elai et Uriah. David is doing everything through messengers. He's sending this guy, sending that guy, right? He continues, right? And it's going to continue through. What does that imagery give you? That David is sending messengers. He's the king. He can do that, but it gives you the perception that David is sitting on his throne like this and fetch me, right? He's the king, right? He's able to do that, right? But you'd think if you were the king and you were doing some shady things, you don't want so many people involved, right? You want to keep that. He could do it himself. Well, he's got to figure. I don't know what he's going to do. He'll walk about. He'll go at night. I understand.
It also keeps him from being confrontational.
So he doesn't want to have to be confrontational with the people whom he's dealing with, but at the same time, it's a double-edged sword. So David is vayishlach. He doesn't have to see anybody. He can do everything sort of on the side. He doesn't have to be confrontational. He's showing his power, his ability to be king. I'm not afraid of anybody. I'll do whatever I want. But in the end of the day, you hope the messengers will be loyal to you. But in the end of the day, the more people he's sending, the more people find out about what's going on. This is what's going to make David's actions public, right? The messengers are going to spread the word and people are going to know that this is what David did. David is not going to be able to hide his actions afterwards because people know about it, right?
Maybe put the blame on them and say, well,
they went and they brought her and I didn't.
They're not going without the permission of the king. The king is the one who's sending them. They're the shalichim of the king.
I feel like he can have deniability if he's not
So-
directly involved.
How? My subjects happened to bring a married woman in front of me and I did nothing about it.
The guy decided, I'm gonna kill the king and I'm gonna bring his helmet and his.
But this is
I
clear.
didn't tell
These
you to kill
people
the
work
king.
for the king. These are the ones who are going to come and they know the king is giving them direct orders of what to do. David's not going to be able to get out of it. Yeah. But the bottom line is David doesn't seem to be worried about that issue. And maybe there's a feeling of I can do what I want. There's a sense of power. When you don't mind, there's a sense of power. You're seeing David exact his power in a corrupt way. Yeah. Oh, so 1 second. So he wants to say that based on this, when Uriah gets called back, he's somewhat suspicious. And what does Uriah do? He doesn't go back to his home. He lays by with the other officers of the king, and he wants to make the claim that likely what happened during the course of that night.
Okay, so what is it? What's the upside of that?
What happened during the course of that night, he wants to say? People started whispering. Uriah started to hear the shlichim and the avadim talking about that. He won't go back home. What's going to happen? David did this. What's happening? And now, what? What's the benefit of knowing that Uriah? That's why Uriah is sending him that message. That's why Uriah is speaking like that to David.
That's not smart.
What? That Uriah.
To make the king upset and say like, and then he's gonna go back to the war, he would know that he's in danger and he ends up.
So that's part of it that falls flat for me, which is David is going to send Uriah to his death in Uriah's own hands. Uriah, if he was suspicious of David, would have opened up the letter and would have noticed it. So you'll tell me if you think that this runs through. We didn't get to the letter yet. But watch. You'll save it till later, but watch what he wants to say. I'll show you what he says. He says the following. He says
Uriah is the victim.
Uriah is the victim. For sure, Uriah is the victim, and we're going to see how that victimhood comes out and about with a comparison to Eshet Yefat Toar in a moment. I'll show you how that comes. But he wants to say over here, I'll read it to you. He says, ואף אם לא כולם ידעו את הדבר במפורש, קשה היה שלא להבין את הקשר בין ביקורה האחרון של בת-שבע בבית דוד, ובין חזרתו המפתיע של בעלה לירושלים במצוות דוד. קיצורו של דבר, he said, what did that mean? Even if not everybody knew explicitly, he says it's difficult to see, לא להבין את הקשר, to not see the connection between the criticism of האחרון של בת-שבע בבית דוד, right, of BatSheva in the house of David, to the return of her husband to Yerushalayim with the command of David. He's saying that the statement by Uriah and the connection between the events seems to say that Uriah had at least suspicions, if not maybe even knew. Maybe he couldn't call the king out directly. He says, Le'or zot, based on this, nitan lehavin et leshono hacharifa shel Uriah. The sharp language of Uriah, where he says what he says, mistaber, it's logical, why does he say, and I'm going to go lie with my wife? What was he doing? Hint, hint, you lied with my wife, right? Ramaz Uriah le David, he hinted to them, the way you did it, Uriah hasaf efo bederech remez, he hinted to him the problem. I could see where this is maybe not so convincing. But he wants to say that's his thought process. I have a hard time believing it because then why would Uriah go after David? Why would he be so trusting of David later on in the story? It's hard to imagine. But the bottom line is there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes over here. There's clearly, maybe even Uriah said something to him without realizing what he was saying. Like he prophesied without prophesying it. He kind of like hinted to David without even knowing what it is that he hinted, right? In the end of the day. But there's a very gray web going on over here, very dark web happening. Yeah.
Is there any chance that he really knows what's happening and this is almost a way of saving face, like whatever happens?
Uriah?
Yeah.
Why? Because Uriah is just going to let it go. He's not going to challenge the king.
Is there shame involved in that?
Shame, maybe. There's definitely shame feeling about us, but this maybe I don't want to say a sense of pride, but the king slept with my wife. I mean, that's a weird thing to say. I don't think that that's going on whatsoever. Why if Uriah knows why he wouldn't say something more directly, I'm not sure. It's one of the problems with Rabbi Zak's theory, I think, but it's an interesting theory to keep in the back of your mind. Now, but I think the point of Vayishlach is very important to make note of, right? The idea that David is sending is he's being very careless, right? He's definitely not covering his tracks. That's where the arrogance comes in. He doesn't feel he needs to cover his tracks. I'm the king. I can do what I want. I could send for this. I could send for that. And David's going to get hit with a major reality check that you don't have as much as you really think you do when he starts to get criticized. In the interim, David's got a problem that he needs to solve, which is, how's he going to unload the culpability from himself? How's he going to get Uriah to go home? So he tries again in verse 12. He tells him, stay another day, and tomorrow I'll send you back to the war. And Uriah once again stays in Yerushalayim on that day and the next day. Verse 13. And but he does not go home. He refuses to go home. Yes, he's strong, very, very sharp towards David, for sure. He's not going to let anything go here. And this is another thing that maybe Rabbi Zak, his adamance, why he's so adamant about not going home. Why would he be so adamant? I mean, you could say he's very moralistic, but for 3 days not to go home, not to see his wife, not to have a meal, he's that adamant about not enjoying anything while his people are at war. Maybe he somewhere behind the scenes knows, I don't want to go home because then I give him an excuse. So I'm going to make sure not to go home. I'm not going to give him what he wants.
Maybe he's really mad at his wife.
Maybe. If he knows, maybe he is also. Perhaps. All of this are possibilities. Yeah. Verse 13. Vayikralo David. So David goes to one last resort before he has to get sticky. Vayikralo David vayochal lefanav vayesh vayshakerehu. David calls Uriah to a meal, and they're going to have a banquet together. So he makes him eat in front of him. If I can't get him to eat on his own, I have to call him to in front of the king, and he can't refuse the king. So he eats and he drinks and he becomes intoxicated. David thinks, okay, if I intoxicate him, maybe then he'll for sure go home and be with his wife. He goes out at night. Once again, Uriah does not go home. He's still of somewhat sound mind not to go home. And he lies again with the servants of the king. And he does not go home. So David realizes this mission is futile. I cannot get Uriah to go home. So he's going to have to resort to more extreme tactics. And here's where this is where when a person gets into a problem and they need to now compound the problem by doing something else, right? Instead of just coming out and maybe admitting it or saying I did the wrong thing, talking to Uriah, mentioning what it was, instead David says, I got to get rid of this problem. And what's he going to do? He's going to basically send Uriah to his death. Vahi baboker, it was in the morning, Vayichtov David sefer el Yoav. David writes a letter to Yoav, Vayishlach beyad Uriah, and he sends it in the hand of Uriah. The irony, like it's wild. He's basically, that Uriah is carrying his own death sentence back to Yoav, right? How David knew Yoav that Uriah would not look at the letter, I'm not sure. David knows, maybe exactly. That's what he would have to say. That David knows Uriah is so loyal, he won't even look at the letter, even though he's probably maybe even suspicious of me, or I don't know what, but he still knows Uriah. It just continues to widen the gap between David and Uriah, how loyal and positive a figure Uriah is in this chapter, and how difficult David's actions really are. David writes in this letter to Yoav, Havu et Uriah el mul peneha milchama hazaka. Place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is the fiercest, veshavtem me'aharav, and then retreat, venika vamet, and therefore he will die and he'll be hit. In other words, hang him out to dry. Put him where the fiercest fighting is, and everybody run away and let him die. No. David's not going to leave it to chance. He's left enough to chance as it is already, right? David's not going to leave it to chance. He tells Yoav, this is what I want you to do. Now, I want you to pretend, before we read what Yoav does, pretend you are Yoav and you receive this letter from Uriah. What is going through
It's-
your mind? What's your situation?
It's saying set him up.
Set him up, for
It's
sure.
saying set him up.
And do you follow what he says? You're very loyal, Rashad. You're very loyal. Follow the king. The king does what he wants. And then remember, one of our problems has always been that the Torah puts major restrictions on the king's power. The king does not have the ability to do whatever he wants. Can Yoav, can he refuse David in this situation? Huh? Okay, but Yoav knows that this is not a proper act to do, right? This is corrupt. He knows that it's corrupt. Do you have the right to say, I was just following the king's orders, so I did what I was going to do? And Yoav has no problem maybe refusing David. He's gone against David's will before. He killed Avner behind David's back without David knowing. So it's not as if Yoav is not afraid to go against David's words, right? I don't know. Maybe we would hope, I would say that I would hope that if Yoav received this letter, he would say, no way, I'm not doing this. This is not right, right?
Say, did you read what was in this letter?
Maybe he'd tell what's in the letter. But Yoav has also another problem in his mind. What other problem does Yoav have? If he does it, and he does it the way David described, he looks terrible. How can a commander-in-chief of his forces tell his people, we're all going to retreat and leave that soldier hanging out to dry? He'll lose all his credibility as a commander, right? Yoav says to me, I can't do what David is asked. Even if I want to fulfill the king's words over here of getting Uriah to die, I cannot possibly do what the king asks me to do, because how can I get people to just simply retreat like that in the process? Then every time they would go to battle, the people are going to be thinking to themselves, maybe Yoav's hanging me out to dry. Maybe I'm going to, that you'd lose all your credibility. The unit would fall apart. You'd never be able to go to war again.
And what if they, like, what were you thinking, like, where's everybody going?
Well, he's going to die, so it doesn't matter.
No, but before he.
No, he's going to be left out. He's going to be a sitting duck, right?
Wait,
Basically, they're going to go out. He's going to turn around and boom. He's not going to have enough time to even think such things. He's going to. Maybe so, but that's it. But Yoav says we got to make it look more real, right? So watch what Yoav does. Yoav tries to placate everybody in this situation. And here's where Yoav does, I think, the wrong thing, right? Yoav tries to do what David asked him to do without getting himself into hot water with his people, and tries to placate everybody. And what that's going to lead to is more people dying. More people than what David even suggested die. Right now, David's suggesting, let everybody go, everybody pull back, one guy dies, wipe my hands clean, let's move on, right? David doesn't want many other people to die, but Yoav knows that's impossible. So watch what Yoav does. In verse, go up to verse 16. After Yoav gets this letter, verse 16. Vahi bishmor Yoav el ha'ir. So when Yoav was besieging the city, they're holding the city hostage, right? That's a tactic to win. He stationed Uriah in a place where he knows there were able warriors. What does he do? He tells his group to do something very silly. And the men of the city come out to attack Yoav. And some of David's officers among the troops fell. Basically, what Yoav did was he got too close to the wall. He actually started to encroach on the wall, but why is that a terrible tactic? You're occupying the what? You're on the low ground, right? Who has the advantage in war? Always the high ground. So if they're over on top of the wall and you get too close to the wall, you're a sitting duck. But Yoav plays it out that way. Yoav says, let's go, let's move closer to the wall. And they do it, and many people die, including among them, what does Yoav do? He pretends as if they're doing a real military strategy, although it's a ridiculous one, right? And he can't allow Uriah to die on his own. That's too obvious. So Uriah's got to die with other people. So in order to fulfill David's wishes, so that Uriah has to die, but in a way that won't get Yoav into hot water with his people and with his issues, more people have to die. More people die as a result of that. There's collateral damage. All to what? All to kill Uriah HaChitti. So you're just seeing how one issue consistently leads to the next. David sleeps with a married woman. Now you can't get him to to get the culpability out. He's got to play further. He's got to get one person to die, but he can't leave it with one person to die. He's got to get more people to die. The further and further you dig yourself, the more and more problems seem to arise. Huh?
Escalate. Escalate. Escalate.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. This is what happens, but that's the text is telling us not to lose sight of that, right? That when one person makes a mistake, and when you make a mistake in a position of power, you have the ability to affect the lives of many other people, right? Think about all those family members that lost people because David needed to cover his tracks. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's already too deep into it. Yeah, you're in I heard someone say a rabbit hole or a quicksand or whatever other analogy you want to definitely give. Now Yoav needs to send word back to David to explain to him why he did what he did and to tell him that the job was done. So once again, Vayishlach Yoav sends messengers, Vayaged David et kol divrei milchama, to tell David everything that happened in the battle. Vaytzavet hamalach lemor, and he tells the messenger to say the following: Kechalotecha et kol divrei milchama. After you tell him everything that happened in the battle, ledaber el hamelech, to speak the words to the king's going to have a question for you. The king's going to wonder, why in the world did we get close to the wall while we were sieging it? That's a ridiculous strategy. If the king will get angry, and will say to you, why did you get close? Why did you encroach on the city to battle it out? You have a siege. Oh, what's the whole point of the siege? Bleed their resources until they can't fight anymore. Why would we aggressively attack the city under a condition that we shouldn't have done? He says, when he asks you that question, didn't you know that the people are going to shoot down at you from the wall? After all, verse 21, let's see who remembers this story. Who killed Avimelech, the son of Yerubeshet? This takes us all the way back to the beginning of the book of Shoftim. Remember, Avimelech was one of the children of Gideon, the only one. After Gideon died, and there was 70 children who were all fighting for who's going to be the next one, and Avimelech killed all of them, and he assumed the role, and eventually he had a rock dropped on his head from on top of the wall by a woman, and they all made fun of him that he died because a woman killed him. So how did he die? He died because he got too close to the wall, and they dropped a rock on his head. So says Yoav, everybody knows you don't get too close to the wall. That's why Avimelech, who killed Avimelech ben Yerubeshet? Halo Isha, it was a woman of all people. She threw a projectile, some kind of an upper millstone on him. Vayamot beTevitz, and he died in place of Tevitz. Why would you be so foolish as to encroach upon the wall? Ve'amarta, so you know what you should say back to him? Gam avdecha Uriah haHiti met. Don't worry, Uriah died. Right? Now, if you're the malach, if you're the messenger, you got to be thinking to yourself, how is that an answer to the question? I don't understand. How does Uriah dying answer the question? But it becomes, what did Yoav do? He made it obvious to the messenger. Now the messenger knows also. So Yoav is able to, it just keeps widening, right? That more people know. So Yoav says, hey, I fulfilled everybody's responsibilities. I was responsible to my unit, so I kept my credibility. At the same time, I fulfilled what David did, but at the same time, I also exposed David in the process. So I am also, but the problem is that the text is going to tell us what's going to happen to Yoav eventually. David's going to kill Yoav at the end of his life, or get Yoav to be killed at the end of his life by Shlomo because of this action. David, because of this action, and Avner also. But David is going to tell Shlomo at the end of his life, I want you to take vengeance on Yoav because of what he did to me in this story. Right? What does it mean what he did to you in the story? He deliberately exposed the king in that story while trying to cover his own tracks in the process, right? So Yoav isn't exactly the model person necessarily in this story either. because either you're going to fight the king or you're going to give in to the king. But to try and exonerate yourself, and in the same process, loss of life, extra loss of life, and you expose the king, all to clear your name. Essentially, Yoav thought about himself more than he thought about anybody else. What was his choice? He should have said, I'm not doing this. I'm not letting one of my soldiers get killed. I don't understand. Why would you? How about send word back? I don't understand. Tell me why Uriah Hachiti needs to die. Whatever, but I'd rather die on my moral, holding on to my moral values than do what the king wants. Otherwise, if you're going to do what the king wants, then just do what the king wants, right? I don't know. You want to argue? Yoav did what was best for him. That's the point. Yoav did what was best for him.
Question, say maybe there was miscommunication, like why do you want this to happen?
He definitely could have said all of that. He could have said all of that, but he didn't. Yeah. So that's what he tells him to do. Now the Malach understands so well what Yoav wants him to do. He doesn't even wait for the king to ask him the questions. He just tells it to him right out. But verse 22. Vayelech HaMalach, the messenger goes, Vayavo Vayaged David, and he comes to tell David, Et kol asher shelacho Yoav, everything that Yoav sent him to say. Vayomer HaMalach el David, ki gaveru alenu ha'anashim, vayetzeu elenu hasadeh. The Malach says to David, the people prevailed against us, and they came out to fight us. Vaniyeh alehem ad petach hashar, and they drove us back to the entrance of the gate. Vayoru hamorim el avadecha, and the archers shot at us from alachoma, from on top of the wall. Vayamutu me'avdeh hamelech, and many of the servants of the king died. And he right away just puts in vegam avdecha Uriah haiti met, and also Uriah haiti died. He doesn't even wait for the king to ask him, how come you did that? He just tells him right away Uriah died, because he knows that's what the king really wants to know. That's all the king really cares about. Now, you're David. You get this news back to you. How do you react?
Celebrate silently.
Celebrate silently. Maybe even put on a little bit of a show. Maybe. Watch what David does. Verse 25. Vayomed David el hamalach. David says to the messenger, Ko tomar el Yoav. This is what I want you to send back to Yoav. Al yera be'erecha. Do not be so distressed et hadavar hazeh, for what happened to you. Ki kazo ve'kazeh tochal ha'cherev. The sword always takes its toll. It takes this one and it takes that one. In other words, Yoav, this is what happens when you go to war. This is the nature of battle. This is the nature of warfare. The sword always takes some people. I don't blame you so much for what took place. Don't worry about it. Hahazek milhamtecha el ha'ir. Strengthen your war efforts towards the city. Vehorsa, and destroy it. Vechazekeu. I encourage you. Don't worry. You'll get him next time. Right? Now, again, you could see David is reacting in a very calm way. He doesn't get upset about the fact that there was more loss of life, because what does he care about? Uriah is dead. The tracks have been covered. Everything's been taken care of. And I'm done. They're all playing the game. But it's obvious David should have said. The irony is, in last chapter, Yoav strengthened his brother Avishai in battle. He told him, Chazak v'nitchazek be'ad amenu, strengthen our people for our nation. Hashem is going to help us. They were religiously fervent. They were encouraging each other in battle because they really wanted to fight a good cause. They were fighting Ammon. David is strengthening them to fight, but he doesn't really mean it. He's doing it from a distance. He doesn't see what's going on. He's giving them orders that are disastrous simply for his own personal benefit. And his encouragement is meaningless, right? His encouragement here that Yoav is going to fight is meaningless. He doesn't even really react much to the loss of extra life, something that he probably could have said, hey, that's not what I commanded. That's not what I told Yoav to do. But he doesn't even care, because as long as in the end of the day, Uriah died, he doesn't care how it happened. He suggested one thing, Yoav did something else, other people had to die, so be it. Uriah is dead. That's what I care about. It's a tough imagery. Tough imagery on the part of David. This is what happens when you get entrenched in something of this magnitude, for sure.
How did he even get to that point where he was so lax about even the war effort, and he's just when you separate yourself as the leader from the people you're leading, that's how it happens, right? But when David, it all started when David did not go to war.
Are we saying that
We're gonna Yeah, if you have a message, it doesn't seem to be coming through so well. So maybe type it into the chat if you want. I don't know. Oh, no. Oh, okay. She fell off. I don't know. Okay. What were we saying? Oh, yeah. We were ready to go on to the next pasuk. Where were we over here? Batishma Eshet Uriah. Right. So yeah, I think it's that. I think it's that point. It's the point that when David separated himself from the people and made a divide between his people's needs and his needs. Once you're in the king, you're focused on your own needs. Notice how throughout the chapter again, David is called David. He's not called Hamelech, right? We saw that in last chapter as well, only until the end. But he's always called David. He's not called Hamelech. We saw the same thing in last chapter when he was doing chesed for Ammon, when he shouldn't have been because he was worried about his own personal interests. He was called David instead of being called Hamelech. When he was doing the interests of the nation, he's called Hamelech, right? That's the idea. So that's what happens. When you separate your personal interests as the leader from the interests of the people, that's when that discord happens, and then you're susceptible to anything, right? In fact, it's pretty striking that David basically, and again, I'm saying this with hesitation, David basically commits two of the three cardinal sins, murder and adultery. And that's not even the worst thing that he really does in this chapter. The worst thing that he does in this chapter is his lack of care for his people, right? The willingness and the ability to so easily dismiss everybody simply for his own personal needs is really that's what it is, his desensitization towards the people. That's really the catalyst for everything. So the murder and the adultery are simply byproducts of the fact that he separated himself. And that's really the heart of everything that happens over here. Now, the chapter wraps up with you'll tell me if you think this is a positive or a negative. Verse 26, Vatishma Eshet Uriah Kimet Uriah. The wife of Uriah hears that Uriah died. Kimet Uriah Isha, that Uriah, her husband, had died. Vatispod al Ba'ala, and she lamented and eulogized over her husband. Notice that she's no longer called what? She's not referred to by her name BatSheva. She's called Eshet Uriah, which only, I don't know what you make of that, right? Maybe that's too, yeah. Exactly. It doesn't say Vatishma BatSheva Kimet Uriah Vatispod al Uriah. Doesn't use their personal names. It's using their relationships because I think it heightens the grief and the sadness of the situation. The wife of Uriah, because ultimately that's what BatSheva was, finds that Uriah, her husband, died, and it's the worst news that anybody could possibly hear. And she eulogizes over her husband. That a wife should eulogize her husband, and a sudden death is a terrible thing. Verse 27, Vaya'avor ha'evel, the period of mourning ends. Vayishlach David, David sends once again, Vaya'asfa el beto, and he has her brought to his palace. Well, a mourning period typically is 7 days. Maybe this was a month. There's a few different stages, right? There's a 7-day mourning period. There's a 30-day mourning period. There's a year-long mourning period. It's not 100% clear how much time passes before David takes, but whatever, what do they say over there? A year? Yes, it's definitely before she has the baby, because Vatihilo leisha, she becomes his wife, Vateled lo ben, and she gives birth to the baby. So it's definitely within 9 months. So let's say, for an instance, it's a month. She eulogizes him. She laments over him 30 days. After the 30 days are done, David gathers her to his palace. And he marries her. The baby is born to him. But in the eyes of God, what David had done was evil, right? Was ra. And that's very telling. It's not very often that the text expresses to us God's emotions as to what took place. A lot of times we see God give a punishment, which we then imply God's. But for God to say that this was evil in the eyes of God, what David had done, is very powerful language. I see someone flipping. I see you flipping. What are you looking for? Where does it say in Bereshit? Anybody know? Where is the only other place in the Torah
that it says that this was evil in the eyes of God. What? No, it doesn't say it there. Doesn't say over there. No, later. Okay, so there's another story here. We'll run the parallels. In our story, let me give you the different components, the different elements, and see if you can connect our story to the other story that I'm thinking about. In our story, we have an intercourse and a cohabitation that is not for the purposes of marriage. Okay, that is not done in marriage. Okay, it's not done in marriage. It's a znut, I guess you can call, something of a scandalous, perhaps even looked at as an adulterous type of action. Okay. Okay, good. It only took one element. Wow. It only took one element, but he lays out about 8 of them over here, Rabbi Bazak. Right? He says 1, Yehuda sleeps with Tamar, his daughter-in-law, right? And he does so under the guise that she is a harlot, so it's not through marriage. Even though we know Tamar is justified in what she's doing, because she wasn't given to Shelah, his 3rd son, nevertheless, it's a scandalous type of reaction. David also sleeps with BatSheva, who's a married woman. Next one is both women become pregnant from this scandalous intimacy. In both stories, someone is decreed to die. In the case of Yehuda and Tamar, Yehuda says Tamar needs to die. She doesn't actually die, but she was under threat of death. In our story, David kills Uriah, basically sends Uriah to his death, right? I should be more careful about how I say it, right? David sends Uriah to his death, and that actually goes through. The word shalach, as I noted, was a key word in our story, also appears several times over there as well. For example, the pasuk says that Tamar shaleha el hamiha, sent word to her father-in-law, leish asher el lelo, to the one whom I have despair for him, anochi hara, I have become impregnated. What did BatSheva say to David? Vatar ha'isha vatishlach, she became pregnant. She sent word to David and said, hara anochi, I am pregnant. In the case of Tamar, it said anochi hara. In David's case, it said hara anochi, I am pregnant. But those same words are being used. In both situations, and we haven't read this yet, but we'll read this at the beginning of next chapter, the person who is guilty of doing the scandalous act admits to his mistake. Although at this point, David has not accepted responsibility just yet, he will very soon accept responsibility, and he will talk about his role in committing this terrible act. Other ones, the Yehuda, in the Yehuda and Tamar story, his father-in-law's name is BatSheva, which is very similar to BatSheva, right? Happens to be just an interesting one. The one that we just brought up, the only 2 places in Tanakh where it says that God looked at the person's actions as evil are in this case with David, looking at David's actions as evil. And the other one is what Onan did, that and Onan refused to get Tamar pregnant, knowing that they had a chance to build up the deceased brother's legacy, right? So dies, and the pasuk says that Onan refuses to impregnate Tamar, and that is evil in the eyes of God, and God kills him as a result of that. So we have a lot of these different parallels over here between these 2 stories. The question is, what does it all mean? Why are we paralleling our story to the story of Yehuda and Tamar? Any thoughts? Okay, so in the end of the day, the lineage is going to be interesting as well, right? From Yehuda and Tamar came Peretz. Peretz is the ancestor of David, and from David and BatSheva will come Shlomo. Yeah, David comes from Peretz, who came from the cohabitation between Yehuda and Tamar. So this is like a theme that's running within the family, and eventually it's going to lead to Shlomo, and Shlomo is going to build the Beit HaMikdash, and that's going to lead to the Mashiach eventually. Not a great theme. Not a great theme. Right. Right.
And yet overcome.
Good. So it's about power of repentance. I agree 100% about the idea that greatness doesn't come from perfection, right? That great things will come through people's errors and their mistakes, assuming what? Assuming they're willing to own up to them. right? Now, David has taken his time at first glance from owning up, but he will own up momentarily. And God gives him an opportunity to own up, and in that opportunity to own up, he does own up to it. But even before that, David does own up in one way. How did you feel at the end of this chapter when you found out that right after Uriah dies and right after the mourning period is over, David takes BatSheva to be his wife? That make you, huh? How would that have looked in our, huh? At first glance, yeah, Eileen. Right. So it's interesting because probably in our society, it would have gotten looked at as that's horrible, right? So he sleeps with her, then he ends up getting her killed, and then we mourn for him for 30 days, and now he's got her, and he got what he wanted. Most people would say, huh? Right. So that's the other way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that David, by marrying BatSheva, did not disassociate himself from his deed, right? David could have, even though he didn't get Uriah to sleep with his wife, David could have tried to say, it's not mine, it's not my problem, it was a mistake, go out of here, right? Sometimes when people make those mistakes, they don't want to take care of the mistake after that it's done. They want that mistake out. David not only says, I don't want my mistake out, he says, I have to hold myself accountable for that. He hasn't really hit him the gravity of what he did. It won't hit him until next chapter when the prophet Natan HaNavi comes to him and describes to him how bad his actions really are. He hasn't said the words chatati, I've sinned, but you could already see David is still somewhat willing to accept responsibility for what he did by taking BatSheva in. It's a small act in comparison to the problems that we've levied upon David. We are not saying that, David is such a great person in what he did in this story because he ended up marrying BatSheva. But there's something there. In the end, you do see naturally David's kindness and his good character come out in one element of the story, that he does not simply just dismiss BatSheva and say, go somewhere and rob. But typically, as we will see in a couple of chapters from now, after somebody lusts after somebody and gets his fill, what usually happens at that point? I'm done with you, right? When Ahashverosh has his way with certain women, he says, okay, I've had my way, I'm done with you. In 3 chapters from now, chapter 14 and 15, we're going to see one of David's sons, Amnon, rapes his half-sister, Tamar, because he lusted after her. And the minute he's finished with the act, he says, you repulse me, I'll see you later, right? That's the nature of that type of an act. If it's simply lust, generally speaking, once you've fulfilled that desire, that temptation, you're out. I'll see you later. The king says, I have no more need for you anymore. You're dead to me, right? David doesn't do that. To his small credit, David does not do that. He takes BatSheva, he deals with the child that is born to him, and he has to live with that mistake in his palace every single day. Now, David's ownership is not done yet. That's going to come up in next chapter when Natan HaNavi comes. So there's still a lot more to piece together. By the way, to compare it to the story of Yehuda and Tamar, Yehuda does not do that. Yehuda sleeps with Tamar. They have twins, and the pasuk says, "Velo yasaf od leda'ata." He never cohabited again, Yehuda, with Tamar. Now that may have been the right decision in that story because Yehuda is her father-in-law. It's not appropriate for him to. But we don't see that she was given to Shelah. We don't see that she was taken care of. What happens to Tamar after that? It says, Lo yasaf od leda'ata. He doesn't know her anymore. He did not know her anymore, right? So to a certain degree, there's a little piece of the Yehuda and Tamar story that's kind of left hanging. What was the end of Tamar? The Torah doesn't tell us, right? Was she taken care of, not taken care of? It was really more to get to the birth of these 2 twins, Peretz and Zerach. And maybe she was taken care of, but there's a little piece hanging over there. Here, David does not leave that open-ended. He takes her, has her, and she's his wife now, for better or worse. Yeah.
So it says in here, one of the commentaries, whether the mourning was more than formal, we cannot tell. She was saved from her predicament and knew that David must take her for his wife. Probably after 7 days of mourning, if David's scheme to make the child appear legitimate was not to be undone, he could not wait long.
So what does that mean?
So it was a shortened mourning period, so he could take her quickly so that when she has the baby, everything looks.
In other words, he wanted to take her right away so that he could be with her, so that everybody will think that the baby's born is not born, wasn't born to him at the time of.
And also
Right,
that-
which means that this chapter, if David wants to make the child look legitimate, the chapter would then have to be taking place in a matter of days, right? From the time that David slept with BatSheva till the time that the mourning period is over is a very short amount of time. That for sure, right? For sure. It had to be in a very, very quick amount of time in order to, it's a lot of back and forth, in order to make the appearance that this child was born to David and BatSheva after Uriah had already died, right? Even still though, taking the woman who just lost her husband and impregnating her still doesn't have a great look. But don't forget, everybody knows when this happened. David didn't cover his tracks. His messengers know. How do we know that? How do we know this whole story? Because of the messengers. Yeah.
So we don't actually hear her speak. You know, the only time we hear her speak is later in life when she tells us.
She says 2 words in this whole story. Anochi hara, I'm pregnant. That's it. She has no other words in the whole story. So in Melachim, the beginning of Melachim Aleph, David has to contend with BatSheva because it seems as though BatSheva's child Shlomo is the one that was promised to be the next, to be the heir to the throne. Where BatSheva comes up in other places, I don't recall. She may have some other role a little bit later on, for sure. Yeah.
It sounds like there's really only one sort of.
What do you make of the word davar over here?
And it says it right after. It says right after. This one doesn't marry Tamar.
Onan. There it says Vayera be'eneh Hashem asher asa, that which he did. Doesn't say had the word had davar. Davar here could be a general word for the whole event, the whole episode. Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to take a look at that in a little bit of depth. Yeah, so I'm looking around here at some of the commentaries. Yeah, the Malbim says, I think over here what Esther wrote over there, and read over there in her book. Malbim says David almost took the BatSheva in like as a kindness. Oh, look, David cares about the lost, the widow, and so nice. And look, David's taking care of her. Like David almost did it in a way that looked as though he was a hero for taking BatSheva. He says, in a way that it looked like that it was now. So he says, it seems as though David thinks he got away with it. David thinks by killing Uriah and immediately marrying her, and then giving birth to the child, nobody said anything. Everybody was fine. Even the messengers who knew, maybe they didn't say anything. David thinks, got away with it. Maybe. I could imagine. I could imagine it for sure. He says, V'hagam shelo. So who's the one who has to come to fight? God has to be the one. It's Vayera be'eneh Hashem. Only Hashem, not anybody else. V'hagam shelo chata lo be'emet Uriah. וכל זה רע הדבר מצד שעשה דוד משיח אלוהי יעקב, והגם שלא היה נענש על זה בדיני אדם, רע הדבר בעיני השם כי לקח דרך גזל. So all of this is evil in the eyes of God because there's no justice here. Justice needs to be served.
I think that's always the moral, no matter what we're doing. It doesn't matter if we're in the closet doing whatever, Hashem always knows. So that's
sure.
like the
For sure. So now the question is going to become, what happens with David? How does God approach this situation? What's going to be David's reaction? How's David going to handle this story? And we're going to see that David will not go away unscathed. He will certainly get his fair share of difficulties and punishments over the course of action in which he took. So I guess we're going to leave it on a cliffhanger for now, because at the end of next chapter, after we go through the teshuvah process, we might then shift a little bit of our thinking about David. And then we also want to take a look into depth about the different approaches that the rabbis take towards this story, because it's well known, many of the rabbis say anybody who says David really sinned, really he didn't sin, they take him out technically. So we have to take a look at all of those different pieces of the puzzle. We're certainly not done yet. So there's a lot more for us to explore. Hang tight. Next week, we'll get even further into it. We probably need another class, maybe class and a half, to really get to the bottom. But we'll see that this story is then going to trigger the rest of our book, basically, because everything's going to center around what took place right here. Hence, it's the middle of the book. It's chapter 11. There's about 23, 24 chapters over here or something like that in Shemuel Bet. I don't remember exactly how many there are. There's 24. So we're really right at the heart of the book, right in the middle of the book, and everything centers of before David and BatSheva and after David and BatSheva is really how you could basically timeline everything that's going on over here. We'll start that next week. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.